columnist for NPR's All Things Considered, and an editor at large for Men's Health, and an editor at Filter magazine. His fiction has been published in Mac Sweeney's. Hollywood Park is his debut memoir. So please welcome to the stage, Mikhail Jolley. And Mikhail, I turn the stage to you.
Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for...
Absolutely.
How do I make them big?
I want to thank Christina. I want to thank Book People.
How?
I know we were supposed to do this whole thing in person, that we were supposed to all be in a room together and telling stories and singing songs. But we were hoping to stay connected in some way. So this is the next best thing. I want to thank Book People and Celadon, my imprint at Macmillan, for all the technical stuff that it took to make this happen. I want to thank all of you for being here. You're also supposed to have the book by now, so it's a little hard to know. We had to push it by a few weeks because of supply chain issues with COVID. So it's a little hard to know what to talk about with people who haven't read the book. I used to joke around that if this was something I could express in less than 400 pages, I wouldn't have had to write the book in the first place. And so this medium, this hour to tell stories, sing songs, it feels a little inadequate, because the journey that it took was 40 years long, and it was overwhelming and strange and terrible and wonderful sometimes, and life-changing and tragic. And so it's sort of like someone saying to you, like, how was your trip to the Andromeda Galaxy? Because it felt a little like floating through space. All this time alone in my head thinking about these things that I never talk about. In a lot of ways, this book, more than anything, was a kind of unmasking. It was an attempt to give voice to a forgotten child and the adult man that child invented to deal with the world. So I guess I'll just start with the earliest memory of my father, since this is a story about fathers and sons. The earliest memory I have of my dad is this vague image of a man I hardly know, and he's walking next to me outside my mother's house in Salem, Oregon. It's my 6th birthday. And he's tall and tan. He's got that big black white boy fro and this Jim Croce mustache that he grew when he got out of prison. And he'd flown all the way to Oregon from Los Angeles that morning and was flying out that night. And there was always something miraculous about the fact that he only came for that one day, for my birthday. It was a message, and it said something very important. You have a father. And it was a shock to learn I had a father. It meant something to my brother and me, since we hardly knew what he meant. We knew we were poor because we lived on food stamps, and we wore clothes from Goodwill and the Salvation Army. And we knew our mom was something called a single mother. And so to us, to the children of single mothers, men were like these faraway magical creatures, these sort of mystical beasts with their beards and trucks. And we knew we would become these things called men someday, but we didn't really know what it meant. We'd only recently escaped the cult where we were born, a place called Synanon. And in that cult, we lived in an orphanage for 7 years, because the leader of the cult had decided that children didn't need parents, and that in his utopian vision of society, the children would be this new type of human being raised without a mother or a father. And at the time, we were told that this, made us special. And then we later learned that it made us something called orphans. At least until the cult turned violent and we escaped on the run and ended up in Oregon, where we went to hide. So to walk down the street with this tall, hairy, funny, dark-skinned, cowboy boot-wearing man who was something called a father, it was like walking through Yankee Stadium with Babe Ruth. I mean, he could do these amazing things like throw a baseball all the way from left field to home plate and swear like he was born to swear, like effortlessly, poetically. We would watch in awe as he said stuff like, that fucking carburetor, those goddamn Dodgers, that asshole Reagan. Until I was 8 years old, I thought Reagan's first name was Asshole. And when I later heard of this guy named Ronald Reagan, I thought maybe Asshole had a brother that decided to run for president. And how can you estimate the power of a phrase like, that fucking carburetor has over a 6-year-old boy who's never known a father? I didn't even know what a carburetor was. All I knew is that when my dad mentioned it over dinner that night and he shook his head, I shook mine too, as if to say, yeah, Dad, Of course, must be that fucking carburetor. That's your problem right there. All I knew is I'd never heard a more perfect expression. I repeated it to my friends for months. Well, see, Joey, the problem with your skateboard's the fucking carburetor. And, well, Mom, I hate to say it, but the reason the oven won't turn on is the fucking carburetor. There were just so many mythologies we'd learned, and we didn't know which ones to believe. The time my dad escaped a Mexican prison, the time he slid his motorcycle straight across the U.S.-Mexico border, the shotgun he carried in a trench coat for 10 years. He was never ashamed about his time in prison. He would tell us stories later when we went to live with him. His inmate number in Chino was A73581, and when the guards would say, "Hey, A73581, step forward," he would say, "I have a name, asshole. Call me by my name. It's not A73581. It's Jim." And they'd say, "Oh, you better keep quiet or we're going to lock you up in the hole." And he'd say, "I'm already locked up. How many times are you going to lock me up?" Sometimes we wondered if he was like a mob boss. You know, like something out of The Godfather. Like, and we'd ask him, we'd say, "Dad, was it organized crime?" And he'd crook his head kind of into a smile and he'd say, "Well, it was more like disorganized crime. We were too high to be very organized about it." You know, he and his brothers, they did stuff like steal cars, run drugs, write bad checks, steal credit card numbers. And my dad always just referred to all this stuff as basic mischief. All of it painted this picture of this charming swashbuckler. That's what it meant to be a man. That's what it meant to be this thing called a man that we hardly knew. At least the men in our family were pirates and thieves, one step in front of the law. And this, of course, led to other questions. Was our father a criminal? Was he an addict? Was he a great man who saved countless lives? Or our mother, was she a hero, a martyr, a victim, an unfit parent, struggling with crippling depression? Or even Synanon, was it a utopian society that was going to change the world? Or was it a violent cult that turned its children into orphans? So, when I was writing the book, it became very important to me just to present my world whole as I understood it as a child, with all the lies, all the confusion, the sadness, the wonder, a little bit of magic, and how the search for love, for a father, a mother, this thing we didn't even know, called a family, is the fiercest and most important journey of a lifetime, especially for those of us born so far from it. I remember that night he tucked us in and he slipped a $20 bill into my pocket and he said, "Here's a little cash. It's nice to have a little cash." And then he gave me a kiss on the cheek and walked to the door, and I felt this tugging, like something stretching to its limit. It was a feeling like I knew we were supposed to stick together. And he paused at the door because maybe he felt it too, and he said, "When you come to Los Angeles, I'm going to take you to Hollywood Park. I'll teach you to bet the ponies with me. There's nothing like a day at the races. You'll see." And then he was gone. And from that moment on, Hollywood Park became a symbol to me. This dirty old rundown racetrack in a forgotten corner of town. And when I thought of where he was in my mind, where this thing called a father was, where these mystical things called men were, it was never at the tire shop where he worked or his apartment by the beach. In my mind, it was always at Hollywood Park. So, Synanon was a strange place to be born. Sometimes it feels like another country, another time, another world. Because it's hard to explain to people the culture of it. You could always see the Synanon people coming from a mile away because for a while, everyone, the men, the women, the children, all had shaved heads. And it started in a good place. It started as a drug rehabilitation community where all these hardened addicts got sober. My dad moved in after he got out of prison to get clean off of heroin, and he always said it saved his life. I mean, it saved countless lives. And eventually, it set out to change the world. And that's when the squares moved in. See, there was the dope fiends. That was the affectionate term for the addicts that were getting clean. And then there were the squares. And the squares were all the kind of hippies and the intellectuals and the change the world types who came in because they believed in this utopian vision of a new society. And that's what my mother was. My mother was a square. She was a free speech activist from Berkeley who participated in all the free speech and anti-war marches there. And then my father, of course, was a dope fiend. And for a while, it worked, this utopian vision of society, or at least it seemed to. But then the old adage is popular for a reason. You know, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So in short, the leader, this guy named Chuck Diedrich, he started to consolidate power. Bank accounts were emptied, marriages were broken up, men were forced into vasectomies, women were forced to have abortions. He started stockpiling guns and threatening lives. And this is how communities become cults. Power is put into the hands of too few, or maybe even just one person, usually a man, usually a narcissistic man. And then the entire community is subject to his whims. And one of those whims was that in the new utopia to come, in his vision of the new society, children would not need parents. And the line was, the parents are only going to fuck them up. That's how the old man put it. You're all a bunch of addicts and thieves and wannabe flower children who come from fucked up homes. You don't give a shit about your children. You're just going to pass on all your bullshit to them anyway. So you may as well have somebody else raise them. And this went on for a long time. And so he got the whole community to agree that at 6 months old, every child in Synanon was taken from their parents and put into what they called a school. And I want to be clear, there were multiple Synanon facilities in different cities, and the school wasn't just, a different building in the same compound. Excuse me. I was up in Marin County, north of San Francisco, and my mother was in Santa Monica, 500 miles away. I was 6 months old. There's always something devious about that Orwellian turn of phrase, calling it a school. Something about calling it that made people think that's what it was. We were taken from our parents at 6 months old, given to strangers. Some of those strangers were only a few weeks off the couch, only a few weeks off getting clean off heroin in the streets. And some of them were wonderful. I had one named Bonnie who treated me like her own son. She walked with me and played with me and hugged me and came to see me on her days off. And it helped. I think I was lucky in that way. But many of the caretakers, what Synanon called demonstrators, were not good people. And we didn't know our parents. We didn't even know what parents were. And so we were very vulnerable. And there's all these stories that have come out now that the children are grown up, that the Synanon kids have become adults. And the stories are hard to hear. Nearly every single child in Synanon was molested. Nearly every child beaten, shamed, neglected, pinned down, head shaved, ritualistically humiliated, ignored. There weren't any birthday parties, no Christmas, no Passover, no family gatherings or toys that we could call our own. I mean, those things are reserved for families. And the worst part was, just the loneliness. Waking up in the middle of the night and there's no one to talk to. There's no one to hold you when you cry. And I'd see my brother on the playground sitting by himself, and he always looked so sad. And of course, despite that Orwellian turn of phrase, stroke of genius it was to call it a school so people would believe that's what it was. Once we got older, we knew it wasn't a school. It was an orphanage. And between my brother and I, we lived there for 7 years. So we eventually left the cult and we moved to Salem, Oregon. And the cult turned violent. When people started to leave, they started threatening violence. And sometimes they beat people up. Sometimes they tried to murder people. And Chuck Diedrich, the leader, had these goons he called the Imperial Marines, and they would go around to everyone and just be all tough. And it was weird because the community had begun with a very strong nonviolence stance. And so, of course, the original principles of the society were being violated, which of course only encouraged more people to leave, which in turn encouraged more violence. So this is when things really started to go haywire, and a lot of people started to leave, and that's when we left. We escaped early one morning without telling a soul, and we drove north. We lived for a while, and initially we drove south and east. We lived for a while in Berkeley and Oakland, and then eventually we found our way to Salem, Oregon, to hide from the goons and hide from the cult. And we left without telling a soul. No one in the world knew where we were. It always felt like we were, like going over the mountains to hide, to just get as far away as we could so we could be somewhere we were safe. Might sink. He would disappear about once a year for a month on these long drinking binges. And he'd show up sometimes on cold nights to chop wood for us and then disappear again, always smelling of beer and puke because he would just sit in his truck and drink. So he was just very sick, but also really kind and warm. And he would take us fishing and watch cartoons in our underwear together, talk to us about our lives, our days, hug us. He was a good man. And after he disappeared, my mom got together with this new guy who he hit my dog and stand over me, daring me to hit him. And he left multiple times, just like a thief in the night. Took all his stuff and moved out of the house, and then came back again, a month or two later with some bullshit explanation. And it's not fashionable to say that children should have the right to tell our parents, hey, this person makes me feel unsafe. It's always treated like it's the decision of the adult. So we go along with whatever narratives the adults tell us about this new person. Things like, he's going to help with the mortgage, or you need a father figure around, or it's my choice, not yours. And these were the things I was told. His name was Doug, and he was what the kids today would call a basic white dude. My dad always used to say, you got to watch out for him, referring to the basic white dudes, the guys in sedans with the perfect hair. And he'd say, how can you trust a guy who can't dance? So I'm going to read very briefly now from chapter 22 of my book. The chapter is called The Men Who Leave. And in this chapter, my new stepfather's moved in. He's already left, as I said, on multiple occasions, just packed his stuff up and left. And, one night I mouthed off to my mom, and he pinned me down and he beat me, and she intervened. I mean, to her credit, she wasn't going to let him beat up her son. And I ran away. I just got on my bike and I started to ride late at night to the West Salem Bridge in search of my first stepfather, Paul, who had disappeared.